Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of Poppies by Jane Weir in preparation for your AQA poetry exam. Poppies. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper, red disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gel-black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me. Skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy, making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial. Leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. The poet Jane Weir was born in 1963. She grew up in Italy and England, with an English mother and an Italian father. She has continued to absorb different cultural experiences throughout her life, and she also lived in Northern Ireland during the Trouble in the 1980s. The poem Poppies is set in the present day, but reaches right back to the beginning of the poppy tradition. Armistice Sunday began as a way of marking the end of the First World War in 1918. It was set up so people could remember the hundreds and thousands of ordinary men who had been killed in the First World War. Today, the event is used to remember soldiers of all wars who have died since then. When Poppies was written, British soldiers were still dying in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a way of trying to understand the suffering that deaths caused, the Poet Laureate Carol Ann Duffy asked a number of writers to compose poems, and this included Jane Weir. The poem itself explores the emotions of a mother remembering her son who has been killed in action. Okay, the form and structure of the poem. The poem, as it says there, appears to have a strong regular sense of form, and the 4 clear stanzas. The stanzas are irregular because they have different lengths. What we need to look at is the word that's highlighted there, caesura. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and if I don't, I apologise. Caesuras, okay, they are breaks in the rhythm. So there's no regular rhythm or rhyme scheme. So the poem is broken up with, God, I hate this word, I hate saying it, caesuras. Now, this careful variation in form suggests that the speaker, the mother, is trying her best to maintain calm and be controlled, but her inner emotions of sadness and grief and loss keep breaking through. So the caesuras show her the fact that she keeps breaking down when she remembers her son, and obviously at the thought of him and at the fact that she's lost him. If we look at the form of the poem, we've got quotations such as 3 days before you left, after you'd gone, this is where it has led me. There's a non-chronicle narrative structure used, the use of the past and the present tense, the first and the second person. The use of non-chronological structure shows that the speaker is remembering past events from when her son is alive. The speaker, who is the mother, is obviously in the present tense, and that is where you get your mix in tenses. The present tense is obviously her stuck in today, and the past tense is when obviously she's remembering her son. Why do we use the past and why does the poet use the past and the present tense? I think it shows you that whilst time has moved on, the mother is unable to do so. She is stuck still in the past, still with the memory of her beloved son. Obviously, we have the first and second person as well. The poem switches from her last memory of her son to her visiting the memorial. And even within this memory, she remembers moments from when her son was a young boy. Okay? The shift in time reflects the different ways in which she remembers him and the different ways in which she grieves. So obviously when she's at the memorial, she grieves for him by remembering him and remembering moments from when they were together. If we go back to the use of the first and second person pronouns, they convey how the speaker, the mother, is trying to make a connection to her lost son. She directly addresses him, and by doing so, it's as if she keeps the memory alive. And then when we link that to the present tense, it's the mother attempting to always remember the son and not forget him, obviously, and, to keep those memories fresh and alive. I'll go into more detail about language as we go through each stanza in a minute, but if, just as a general summing up types of language that are used, there's military language used throughout, such as blockade and reinforcement. You've got metaphors as well. Spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade, bandaged around my hand. And we've also got a lot of language that evokes colour and texture because she refers to sewing on a few instances. All right, so we're going to go through that in more detail as we go stanza by stanza in a couple of minutes. Okay, metaphors. The metaphors used by the speaker show how the mother cannot escape from an awareness of her son's violent death. Her memories enable her to maintain a connection with her son, but she is unable to avoid thinking of injury and death. In addition to that, the use of colours and texture, which I mentioned earlier in the poem, specifically in the first stanza, show how the speaker is remembering the smallest of details, the finest of details. When she talks about the embroidery and things like that, and the sewing and the stitching and the colours and all of those fine details, it shows us that because of the loss she has suffered, her memories are more vivid. They are more detailed. For the reader, it is more realistic and it is certainly more emotive. Which links into imagery. Obviously, when we're talking about the mother remembering things in vivid detail, then she remembers specific images. You've got spasms of paper red. So the red of the poppy, it is linked to a wound, isn't it? And that colour red inevitably reminds us of blood and death. We have also, there's a lot of childlike images and there's a lot of innocence in there, obviously, because remember, she's thinking back to reminiscing about her son. So we get the being Eskimos like we did when we were little. And obviously, when she's remembering her son, she remembers how innocent he was, which, does add that emotion to the poem. He's died, an innocent man has died. And as said earlier, we assume that it's in a violent way, especially through the word bandaged. We've got the releasing of the songbird from its cage. This metaphor suggests that she's let her son go. She's had to let him go in different ways. Obviously, she let him go to war. I think sometimes mothers have to let go a little bit and let their children become more independent. Obviously, the irony through that is that when he's gone to war, unfortunately, she's lost him, so she's had to let him go in that respect. And obviously, it's the letting go of emotions. So that particular image of the songbird in the cage is powerful on numerous levels when you're talking about the theme of letting go. And obviously, it's metaphorical, isn't it? Because the son then becomes the bird. The image of the dove, obviously the dove pulled freely against the sky. As we know, a dove is synonymous with an image of peace. So if he's the bird that's been released from the cage, and then we hear about the dove, we can make a connection that perhaps he's been compared to the dove. The innocent dove. Dove is white. The colour of white has connotations of innocence. So therein lies another theme: the fact that to her, her son is innocent and he's died. And obviously to the reader, a lot of soldiers, innocent soldiers, are killed in awful ways in war. The image of the poppy in the first stanza highlights how this is a poem about remembrance for fallen soldiers. Not only is it a symbol of remembrance, but it is also a symbol of conflict. Remember, we all put our poppies on in remembrance of people. So therefore, not only does it symbolise those soldiers that we've lost, but it also reminds us of war and conflict. The shape and the colour of the poppies hint at bullet wounds. When we hear spasms, the word spasms suggest perhaps that the son's injuries were fatal. In the second stanza, the speaker remembers her son's childhood, and with this memory comes the memory of him leaving home for the last time when she pulls the cat hair off his clothing. Obviously, that's when he's leaving home for the last time she's ever going to see him. So you've got two memories running along there. Obviously, the memory of him being a child when she wants to play Eskimos with him, and obviously the memory of him leaving home. And therefore, what stanza 2 does is it provides us with a contrast between the childlike innocence of the son and the son when he is a man. She wants to run her fingers through his black hair. We're told that the hair's thorns. So that metaphor there, as when men grow up, they I suppose they don't want their mother mothering them, if you understand what I mean. So the idea that his hair is like thorns, it's the idea that he's almost repulsing her in terms of her mothering him before he leaves, because he's a grown man and he doesn't obviously want his mother running her fingers through his hair. So the idea of the thorns has a horrible irony in it, really, because obviously he hasn't realised it's the last time he's going to see his mother, and the prickly thorn, as if he's resisting her affection, if you like. Just a little bit more detail about the metaphor of the songbird. Don't forget that whilst the men that go to war are extremely brave and courageous, the families that are left behind are as well, which I think sometimes can be forgotten. And the songbird is a metaphor, as we said before, on a couple of different levels, but it's also about the speaker as well. The speaker wants to be strong when she says goodbye, which she is. And after the son has left, she goes up to his bedroom and she breaks down. As I said earlier, the metaphor does signify other things. It signifies how she's letting go of her child. She's letting her child go to war. And I don't have experience of that, but you can assume that is an awful thing to go through, emotionally traumatizing, I'm sure. Her emotional response contrasts with the son, who leaves intoxicated. Yeah, he leaves, and we get the simile of that the world's like a treasure chest, and he's really excited to go out there and be independent and experience the world for himself. And obviously the mother contrasts with that because she's extremely upset that she's had to let her child go. And obviously, as I said earlier, the sad thing about that is that she's had to let him go forever, because naturally, within the poem, he does not return to her. As I mentioned earlier, there's no regular metre or rhyme scheme. The poet has chosen to use free verse. Now, free verse links in nicely with the image of the bird, the caged bird that's set free, because we are reminded of the freedom that the son is desperate to have when he goes into the treasure chest of the world and experiences it. And to an awful extent, actually, the mother is free of the son. Not in the way that she would like. So free verse there allows that to happen. It also adds, this probably sounds silly, but it does add that serious, sombre undertone to the poem, which, when we add the frequent, pronounce this word again, caesuras to the poem, and we have her inner emotions breaking through of sadness, then obviously we are presented with the mother who is grief-stricken, distressed, devastated at the loss of her child. If you go back and read the poem and you stop at the punctuation, obviously our A's and A stars, or our number 8s and number 9 students should be taught about punctuation. And if you read it and you stop every time there's a full stop and a comma, you stop them quite frequently. And obviously the mother is trying to control herself and not let her emotions come through. But these pauses inevitably show us that it is a great struggle for her to explain the memories and the loss of her child without breaking down. Tone is pretty straightforward in this poem. We have the link to World War I when we hear 3 days before Armistice Sunday. We have the sense of bravery in the speaker, obviously to power through and explain her experiences of this loss. Bravery, I suppose, extends itself out to the soldiers as well who are fighting in the war. Steel, the softening of my face, metaphor there. We also have the sad and mournful tone, which I mentioned earlier, and it's sad and mournful, obviously, for the speaker, but also for the reader. I trace the inscriptions on the war memorial. The whole poem is extremely distressing and upsetting because we are hearing about her mother and a devastating loss that she has incurred. The link to Armistice Sunday as well shows us how long poppies have been a symbol of remembrance. If you go back to World War I, it's almost a century, isn't it? They've been used as a memorial to our dead. Or is it a century? Is that my maths? Anyway, it's a very long time that we have been using them as a symbol of remembrance. This suggests a hint of regret and sadness that we still have young men making. Sorry, I can't get my words out. Making the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Another sad thing as well about the poppies is that we no longer just wear them to commemorate World War One. It's for all wars. It's almost as if we haven't learned our lesson, isn't it? World War One, World War Two, conflict with Iraq, conflict with Afghanistan, and therein lies this hint of regret. The idea that we are still fighting and still having to try and use violence as a means to end a conflict. Okay, stanza 1. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. So Armistice Sunday sets up exactly what the poem's about. We're remembering soldiers. The word poppies, which is the title of the poem, it has massive symbol as a poppy, because now it is symbolic with war and death, really, isn't it? And remembering those we've lost, which again has that awful emotive link to it, especially for the reader. If we carry on, they had already been placed on individual graves, so people are placing the poppies on the graves well before Armistice Sunday, because it's their way of showing their respect to those that they've lost. When we're talking about language as well, don't forget that the poem is heavily emotive, and the word graves is massively emotive. It's plural, which again reinforces the fact that thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers have given their life, and obviously grave is associated with death, and the fact that we have lost so many men due to different wars, World War One, World War Two, Iraq, Afghanistan, thousands. I mentioned pronouns earlier, but you've got them here. Before you left, I pinned. So you've got the pronouns, the direct pronoun you, personal pronoun I. Remember, she's speaking to her son to try and maintain that connection, to not lose his memory, to not forget him. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel. So we get that memory of before he went to war, she gave him a poppy. Crimped petals, spasms of paper red. If you look at crimped petals there, there's an idea that it's almost foreshadowing in the fact that the petals of the poppy are ruined, and when her son goes off to war, to a certain extent, he is ruined. When we hear the word spasms and bandaged, we think of some awful injuries that he could have endured. And then the spasms of paper red, that word spasms, it's uncomfortable for the reader, and it does suggest an injury that her son has suffered. The colour red, I probably don't need to explain that to you, but remember, again, red is symbolic of death, of blood, and the poppy is red. So you've got those links there, and we are assuming that her son has suffered some injury or some awful death. Again, the colour red there would remind us of blood. Disrupted a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Speaks for itself, doesn't it, really? Stanza 2 begins with sellotape bandaged around my hand. I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could. So before he leaves, she's using sellotape to take the cat hairs off his blazer. So again, a mother looking after her son, or trying to look after her son. But what we have there, interestingly, is the metaphor of bandaged. Now, bandaged there, once again, reminds the reader or refers to a potential injury that he has suffered. So we once again, as a reader, we imagine that his death has been painful, and he's endured something awful. So she's being the mother here and trying to wipe all the cat hairs off him and make him look smart. Smooth down your shirts, upturned collar, all the typical things a mother does when a son puts a suit on, they're trying to make them look smart and try to look after them. Steal the softening of my face. Now this metaphor is important because she is trying not to show her emotions and trying not to break down. So steeled the softening of my face, and steeled, obviously she's trying her best to compose herself and stay strong. And when he leaves, she goes upstairs and breaks down, doesn't she? So the theme of bravery is mentioned here. We carry on with stanza 2. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. So we've got two memories running along here, as I said earlier. The memory of him leaving for the first time, the memory of him being a child. And she wants to, run, like, that Eskimo kiss you do with your nose when you're little. And she's got this poignant, emotive image of him being a child and being innocent. And remember, innocence is another one of our themes. Like we did when you were little, look at the adjective little, that reminds us of her remembering him as a young child, as an innocent young child playing around. We've got the verb play. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. Again, I did do that image earlier, but just to reiterate, she wants to, as a mother does, run her fingers through his hair, but he doesn't want her to. He's a grown man. He doesn't want her to mother him. And then you've got the metaphor of his hair being thorns, and it's this idea that, I don't want to use the word prickly, but he's prickly towards her in the sense that he resists her mothering attempts and her over affection. Well, that's probably not the right word, but the fact that she's being overprotective. And obviously the sad irony in that is that she didn't protect him in battle, which is an awful thing to think. All my words flattened, rolled and turned into felt. Again, metaphor there, because she's fighting off the emotion and she can't do it, but also he doesn't have the same response leaving home as she does. So she's really upset that he's leaving, but he isn't upset. He's excited to get out there and experience the world, isn't he? Slowly melting obviously links back to the fact that she's trying not to break down, but she does. I was brave. Bravery was mentioned earlier. It is one of our themes. She is brave to let him go. He is brave to go to war. And then that goes out to all of the soldiers who are brave and go to battle, and all of the families who, sit at home and let them. As I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. Remember, she's upset that he's leaving, but he isn't. So you've got this simile of like a treasure chest, and the idea of treasure, and he wants to go and experience the world and see what what he can experience and what he'll learn. Again, for the reader, there's an awful instance of foreshadowing there in the sense that, unfortunately, we know he dies. So it doesn't quite play out the way he thought. A split second and you were away intoxicated. I think intoxicated is metaphorical there, because I don't think it means drunk. I think it means he's intoxicated at the world around him and how excited he is about it. After you'd gone, she is addressing him again. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. I'd done that metaphor in a lot of detail earlier, if you watched the beginning of the video, but really quickly, we'll just go back over it. Releasing the songbird is about letting go. The songbird, the mother being quite brave, but also the songbird is the son, because obviously he's released and he is free to go and experience the world. And then when we go to the line underneath, which is the dove, the dove is white. White has connotations of innocence. The dove is a sign of peace and innocence. So again, this idea that the dove is a symbol of peace and he's going to a war, there's an irony there. It could also mean that he is the dove, in the sense that, remember, we've had this innocent child and he's gone off to war and he dies and it obviously doesn't return. So you've got this idea that perhaps the son is the dove here, that this innocent little dove who's flew off to experience something but unfortunately, is killed. This is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats. The metaphor of her stomach there, and that awful phrase, this is where it has led me. The stuff about her stomach is her emotions, I think, when he was at war, before he died, when he left, and obviously when she's lost him, the idea that she feels sick, her stomach's, in knots, waiting to hear news. Obviously, when she hears the news, it's horrendous news. So the idea of her stomach, making tucks and darts and pleats, it's the idea that she's ill, isn't she? Ill with grief at the loss of him. And we have the ending of the poem. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial. Now again, hill, I think we can say that this is metaphorical. It's like an uphill battle, isn't it? And that does sound like a cliche, but an uphill struggle for her to accept that her son is gone, for her to accept that her son has died. So obviously the hill is physical, she walks up the hill, but I think it's also metaphorical in that instance. I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, so you can imagine her running our fingers through the lettering of his name. Extremely emotive, massive image there on the war memorial, because obviously what's left of our son, well, all we can do now is remember him, and then the war memorial there goes universal, doesn't it? Because it becomes a war memorial for every soldier that's died, which, as I said earlier, is thousands and thousands, leaned against it like a wishbone. Again, simile here, it's reader interpretation what you think of it, leaned against it like a wishbone. As we know what we do with wishbones, they're very easy to snap. I think that what she's seeing here is that she's like a wishbone, in the sense that she's extremely vulnerable, fragile, weak. She is broken, or she is at the point of break, obviously, because she's standing over her son's grave. I mean, I'm not a mother, but arguably, the worst thing to happen to a mother, to lose their child. The dove pulled freely against the sky. We have the image of the dove again, this innocent image. The dove pulled freely against the sky. If we look at that adverb, freely, it's the awful idea that he's free in terms of, free of the war, but free of, awful to say, but free of life, because he's dead. So again, the idea that perhaps he is the dove in the sky to her. Against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Again, reader interpretation, but I do think hoping is one of the most powerful words in the whole poem, because it's futile, isn't it? Her hope to hear him, his voice, is futile, because she will never hear his voice again. Hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Again, metaphorical. Playground has, again, we finish with an image of innocence here, and the playground. And the awful image that we finish with is her desperately hoping to hear him or see him. And unfortunately for her and in the reader, that isn't going to happen. So the poem, obviously it's distressing all the way through, but it does obviously end on this awful note where you've got the mother standing at the grave, wishing to hear her son. She's a broken, fragile woman, and she won't ever hear from him again.